Now, you've probably seen that scene in the movie 300 where the Persian emissary arrives and he and Leonidas are talking and he's making, a simple demand of earth and water as a sign of Leonidas's surrender, that the elements of Sparta's wealth, these things, say, we're giving these things to you. You now have authority over them. And what's interesting here is if you watch that scene, you watch how Leonidas reacts. It's the fact they get that right. They get that attempt at intimidation right, historically speaking, because that's what this is. This is an act of intimidation, because it's not saying that the threat is empty, but in terms of rhetorical force, it supports the contention. Hello again, everyone. I am Sugarman1976, and welcome back to the BLOGCAST. This is, of course, part 2 of our analysis of Kipp Davis's video in response to Gavin Ortland about the war texts in the Bible. In part 1, we set out to outline the discussion from Kipp's point of view, and I noted there were a number of interpretational concerns that I had with his approach. I also noted that Kipp seemed to sometimes appear to misunderstand analogies that Gavin was using. Now, it's not to say I didn't have some criticism for Gavin as well, because I pointed out that he doesn't seem willing, by the use of a particular definition, to admit that it was at least reasonable that one could conclude that genocide was in view in the behaviors of the Israelites at the time. Now, does that mean that I believe that this is the end of the case? Of course not. Now, again, like I said, this is part 2 of part 1. You can see part 1 here, and I hope you do if you go back and see it if you hadn't watched it already. I realize this is a rather esoteric subject, but I'm glad you're here. If you don't mind, please hit that like button. And if you're not already subscribed, be sure and hit that subscribe button. Also, if you're looking for something that's less esoteric and a whole lot more fun, you can also check out my debut novel, A Turning of Shadow, which is available in both Kindle and paperback. And you can find it on Amazon. Of course, links will be in the description below for all of the sources, especially Kipp and Gavin's original videos, as well as links to part 1. Now, at the end of part 1, I noted that this argument is essentially going to be one about language, specifically how terms are used and understood. I said back then that our language, the English language, especially our English translations, appear to contribute to this difficulty. I also noted that there's some historical ignorance on our part that we seem to run into and we'll see this as we go forward. But just to kind of bring it back to our minds here. Deuteronomy 7, verse 1 and 2. Come on. There we go. When the Lord your God brings you into the land you are entering to possess and drives out the many nations before you, the Hethites, Girgashites, Amorites, Canaanites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites, 7 nations more numerous and powerful than you, and when the Lord your God delivers them over to you and you defeat them, you must completely destroy them. Now, I'm not saying that this is the only troubling passage, and I noted that the problem most people seem to have is with what gets translated as completely destroy them. Now, what most commentators will point out when you're looking at this passage is that the verb that gets translated as completely destroy is something of an emphatic form of the verb HEREM or KEREM, and the pronunciation depends on whether it's being used as a noun or as a verb. And it's in this clip that we're going to look at from Kipp's video. And it's a little bit of a long clip, but I want us to listen in and I want us to appreciate what's being said here. Now, Kipp had some audio issues, cut out a few seconds where those issues became more pronounced. But again, the full video is linked below in the description. So let's just listen in.
So just to get into it a little bit, we've already seen this Hebrew word herem, often translated when it's a verb to totally destroy. And this can also be used in other ways. You can talk about something being given over to the Lord completely, like in the temple, for example. In Leviticus 27, this verb is used to describe a field or an animal that's been set apart to the Lord. But in the context of battle, it has a very particular meaning. Chris Wright refers to herem as that specific form of warfare in which Yahweh is the chief protagonist and the enemy is renounced or devoted to him.
I'm just going to pull that definition back on the screen here. Take a look at that specific form of warfare in which Yahweh is the chief protagonist and the enemy is renounced or devoted to him. You know, this is an okay definition. I'm not gonna quibble with it too much, but I'm gonna point out here that in the apologetics that I've looked at with regards to this question, there is a frustrating lack of engagement with the idea of HEREM as a cultic term. Gavin hinted at it a little bit when he talked about how this word can be used for notions of excommunication. It can mean to dedicate. It can mean forbidden. It can be used to declare something sacred. I'm just going to pull up my notes here again. All right, so this is the definition of the verb HEREM, from which the noun HEREM is derived, as it appears in the standard work, the Hebrew Aramaic lexicon of the Old Testament. You can see here it's got a relatively flexible usage. It's always restricted to these cultic sacramental sorts of settings, which is really, really interesting when it comes to the hiphil form of this verb, which is how it's used in descriptions of warfare, how it appears most prominently in the books of Deuteronomy and Joshua, and through some other parts of the Deuteronomistic history, most frequently, right? Here, Chalot says that it means to put under the ban, to devote to destruction, especially war booty or cities, with all that is in them, all inhabitants, all male, the cattle. The intended meaning here has to do with dedicating something to Yahweh by the ban as a means to rule out the possibility of redemption. So,
all right. So here's my issue with the use of the term harem, specifically in regard to a type of warfare, as if it is the objective of the action rather than the result of the action. Now, I'm not necessarily disagreeing with what the word means in technical terms. Rather, what I'm disagreeing with is the application of the term. I think it's erroneous to use it as kind of an adjectival form. And so this is where I'm going to disagree with Christopher Wright, whose book is really it's interesting. It's informative. I think he kind of gets sidetracked there a little bit. And Gavin and Kipp, because I think it's misleading. And the reason why is John Walton in his book, The Lost World of Israelite Conquest, notes the common English translation of the Hebrew word cherem, which the ASV translates as utterly destroy or destroy totally, or various English translations translate it in different ways, are misleading because they imply that the word specifies something that happens to the object, that is, it's destroyed. Alternatively, we suggest that the word actually refers to the removal of something from human use. Now, this means that when it's said that something is HEREMed, it's classified as unusable or excluded. How this status is eventuated depends on what the object is, whether it's property or a person or some kind of abstraction. In other words, it doesn't tell us what it takes to make the object unusable. It only means that the object has been designated as such. In fact, I'm willing to argue that the term has a great, like Kipp pointed out, has a great deal of semantic flexibility. But there's something else that Walton notes that we need to note, and it's that this classification is irrevocable. Now, Kipp goes on to note that the verb most often appears in the Hiffle form. And you're probably asking, well, what is the Hiffle form? Well, the Hiffle verb form, simply stated, is used to indicate simple causative actions in the active voice. These actions can be dynamic. You cause something to do X. And we see an example of this in Genesis 4:3, where it says that Cain brought some of the fruit of the ground as an offering. Or it can be used statively. That is, you induce a state in X. You can see this in 1 Kings 8:32, where it says, to condemn the evildoer. The evil person has a state induced in them. But then there's also something of an idiomatic form, which is where you make an observation about X. And you can see this in Genesis 6:4, where it says, and God saw the land, and behold, it had become corrupted. So, how does this relate to how HEREM should be understood? Well, Kipp has essentially conceded that the verb is apparently stative. Therefore, that which is kerem, which is the noun form, is heremed from normal use. So here's the question. What is the normal use of an object? And how could that be disallowed? That would essentially seem to depend on the object in question. Now, in this next clip, Kipp is going to give us some definitions of the term harem, and I want us to listen in as he does so.
Inhabitants, all male, the cattle. The intended meaning here has to do with dedicating something to Yahweh by the ban as a means to rule out the possibility of redemption. So I've got some other notes here from a variety of other dictionaries that I'll just read to you. So this is from the New International Dictionary of Old Testament Theology and Exegesis. It says the verb is only used in the causative stem, that's the hiphil. It appears 48 times, and the hofal, where it appears 3 times. It designates a special act of consecration. It involves consecration of something or someone as a permanent and definitive offering for the sanctuary or in war. The consecration of a city denotes also the total annihilation of a population in war. The utter destruction of the city or country in respect to foreign nations appears in 2 Kings 19:11, 2 Chronicles 20:23, Isaiah 11:15, and so on and so forth. And the emphasis is on the element of an action that is radical and total. The nominative form of the verb, haram, which is herem, this is the noun, denotes an act of consecration, extermination, and killing. It involves the exclusion of an object from the use of abuse of humanity and its irrevocable surrender to God. Surrendering something to God meant devoting it to the service of God or putting it under utter destruction. So the nominative is reserved for things and cattle, and occasionally in these contexts, it also is used to refer to human beings. So I'm going to read a little bit from the Theological Dictionary of the Old Testament.
Now, the reason why I put that quote up on the screen is because I hope you heard what Kipp said. I don't think he did it. I'm not saying he did it intentionally, simply because rarely and occasionally in English have semantic overlap. But I think it's important to look at it because some people are going to say I'm just splitting hairs here. But here's the question: I want you to think about it. If you're digging for gold, would you rather dig in a place where you rarely find it or where you occasionally find it? That's what's important. Now, what's the point here? Why am I stopping here and interjecting this? When the term herem, the verb, is used in the Deuteronomic context, that is, the text of Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, it is used to designate a status. It doesn't say how something that possesses that status is treated or handled. It only is only said to possess that status or be placed under that status. Now, why do I bring this up? It's because one of the passages that Kipp pointed out to in the article is, of course, Joshua 6, verse 17, which reads, "But the city and everything in it are set apart to the Lord for destruction." So here we have a noun form indicated by the italics that's being used as a term, as a designated term for Jericho. Notice that everything, both the city and its contents, are designated as karem, the noun form, which again indicates a status. So the city provides the physical boundaries, and it says that everything within that boundary is essentially off limits. But off limits to what? What are the things? And this is where it gets interesting because we get thrown a curveball when we read the rest of the verse. Only Rahab, the prostitute, and everyone with her in the house will live because she hid the messengers we sent. Now, back in part one, I lamented the fact that we are ignorant of history and we're ignorant of certain practices in warfare that were commonly accepted up until I even said 200 years ago to the late 1800s, early 1900s. And there was a common practice among those who engaged in a siege of a city called no quarter. And this is where a besieged city, when it falls or when there was a breach in the wall that would otherwise allow a foreign army to enter, the city had essentially forfeited any rights to peace and security. And it, both its residents and the property within its walls, were fully subject to destruction and pillaging, which is why I then brought up the law, the warfare law that's found in Deuteronomy 20. When you approach a city to fight against it, make an offer of peace. If it accepts your offer of peace and opens its gates to you, all the people found in it will become forced laborers to you and serve you. However, if it does not make peace with you but wages war against you, lays siege to it, when the Lord your God hands it over to you, strike down all its males with the sword, but you may take the women, dependents, and so on and so forth. You may enjoy the spoil of your enemies that the Lord your God has given you. Now, this law, in its ancient context, evidences what was the accepted standard practice of civilized warfare. The Israelites are doing everything they can to paint that they are not barbarians. They are a civilized people. They understand and they practice common warfare. And this is important because, and under the rules of siege warfare that were practiced universally up until, like I said, about 200 years ago, if a fortified city was approached, its inhabitants resisted an offer of peace, but instead attacked or engaged in warfare, then it was subject to punishment for its actions. Moreover, if the city was breached during that siege, its occupants could be given essentially one more time to surrender, but failure to do so would result in the city being sacked, razed, and its inhabitants either killed, driven out, or enslaved. Now, something else that we kind of miss in the Jericho accounts gets right to the reality of warfare, the common practice of warfare, because it gets this point right. Spies would often be dispatched to these cities, not only to find out, about the fortifications or whatever, spies would go into these cities to see if any potential allegiances could be made within the city they were about to capture or to lay siege to so they could ease its capture. Now, Rahab represents such an alliance, which is why, even though she's designated as HEREM, she and everyone in her house, along with the whole city, are designated as HEREM, but they're spared. This means that HEREM, contrary to what the dictionary states, doesn't necessarily imply either killing or annihilation, but instead implies a status boundary without regard to its manner of disposal or enforcement. In fact, this becomes even more clear if we just eliminate two words that I believe are unnecessarily added to our English translations, the words for destruction. Now, why eliminate these two words, which effectively alter the meaning of the sentence? Because it fits with the warfare practice of taking plunder from a siege, as well as what's supposed to happen to it, which we find in verse 19. For all the silver and gold and the articles of bronze and iron are dedicated to the Lord and must go into the Lord's treasury. Now, here we see all the spoil from the siege going to the war leader, who in this case is Yahweh. And it's said to be dedicated, or some translations might read holy here, because the underlying noun here is kadosh. And this term is used only one other time, and it's in the theophany that precedes the battle of Jericho. And what we'll see here, especially as we go into chapter 8 of Joshua, as the spoil from the siege of Ai goes to the people of Israel, where the HEREM thing is the city. This is chapter 8, verse 26. More importantly, the king, according to 8:29, is the target, not the people. Now, notice what I did. I didn't attempt to justify anything the Bible describes. I simply put it in its context, both historically and literarily. The war narratives in Joshua speak in terms and concepts that were normally accepted up until just a few hundred years ago. The only thing I've pointed out is that we can't make assumptions about what a word means until we've seen it used in its context, both literarily and historically. Now, I'm not denying that HEREM, the verb, has cultic implications. What I am saying is we can't be reading any of those implications into the text without reading the entire text in its context. That's called exegesis. Now, that being said, let's listen to what Kipp has to say.
So the point I really want to get across here is that when talking about this idea of HEREM warfare and these texts which describe the total annihilation of people in this sense, it's really, really important to understand it in its cultic context. The idea of HEREM is a sacred idea. I have described this in my course on ancient Israelite religion as a form of human sacrifice. It is a means of transferring the devoted property of Yahweh from this world into the divine realm. In order to do that within an economy of sacrifice, the way you do that, the way you get things from the natural realm to the god, is by killing them or destroying them. The point I really want to emphasize here is that HEREM is a sacred idea, and it's in keeping with this sacred context that we need to see what it means, how it works, and
All right, so point of agreement and then a point of disagreement. I agree that in the economy of sacrifice, in order to transfer an object from the human to the divine realm, the way you do that, assuming it's alive, is to kill it and burn it. However, not everything that's sacrificed is burned or killed. Remember, I've already established that when you HEREM something, especially in the cultic context, you aren't sacrificing it. I mean, technically you are, but actually you aren't in the technical term of sacrifice. You are declaring it off limits from human use. Now, we saw in the instance of Jericho, the spoil was designated for Yahweh, since he is the recognized war leader. Hence, all of Jericho was declared Kerem, even Rahab and everyone in her house. All of that is declared as set apart, verse 19. And the Christian Standard Bible translated the noun kadosh as dedicated, but some translations might render it as holy. It's God's property. It becomes God's property. Now, some of it is burned. Verse 21, we see the city and its contents are burned. The things that can be burned are burned, and the things that aren't burned, the metallic articles, are placed into the tabernacle treasury. Here's where the disagreement is. The hereming of something doesn't necessarily mean that the object was killed or destroyed. What it means is that a distinction was made and observed. How that is enforced isn't described. Now, it may imply that the object was killed or destroyed in the process of observing that distinction, of working out what that distinction means, but it doesn't explicitly mean that, as evidenced by the fact that Rahab and her household, while being designated as Kerem and were haremed, but weren't killed. This is where I think we need to go back to the article because of 2 Kings 19:11. Look, you have heard what the king of Assyria have done to all the kings of Assyria have done to all the countries. They completely destroyed them. Will you be rescued? And here we see the verb being used to imply that something has been destroyed. Now, we assume this because in the very next verse, it says, did the gods of the nations that my predecessors destroyed rescue them, such as these nations? Now, this second verb that gets translated is the verb shakaf. In verse 17, which is a prayer of Hezekiah, same chapter, verse 17 says, Lord, it is true that the kings of Assyria have devastated the nations and their lands. This is the verb karab. Now, these verbs forms are in what is are both in the hifil and in the hafil form. They take a causative and a resultive form. So the result of Syria doing this is this, and the result of verse 12 is what happens in verse 11. So the fact that we have these three verbs in close proximity, harem, shakaf, karem, they're all translated either destroy or destruction or something like that. This appears to imply that they have some kind of semantic overlap, but that can be only incidental and not necessarily related. We should also note that you've got two verbs that have very similar orthography. Now, that to me indicates we should be very, very careful in understanding how these verbs are being used. Now, you're probably asking yourself, Triggerman, how does this solve the problem? And I'm glad you asked that because this goes directly to Gavin's argument about the use of hyperbole in warfare rhetoric. Namely, that in verse 11, this is presented as a speech by an ambassador who is sent by the Assyrian king Sennacherib to intimidate Hezekiah into surrendering. Now, you've probably all seen that scene in the movie 300 where the Persian emissary arrives and he and Leonidas are talking and he's making, a simple demand of earth and water as a sign of Leonidas's surrender. That what those two things represent is the elements of the Sparta's wealth. These things say, we're giving these things to you. You now have authority over them. And what's interesting here is if you watch that scene, you watch how Leonidas reacts. You can the historicity arguments over the scene really don't matter to me. It's the fact they get that right. They get that intimidation, the attempt at intimidation right, historically speaking, because that's what this is. This is an act of intimidation. Because it's not saying that the threat is empty, but in terms of rhetorical force, which is something that we discussed back in part one as part of this culture's embrace and working out of dramatic orientation, it supports the contention. Now, this isn't to dismiss Kipp at all, but in terms of rhetorical force, or to be understood in the cultic context, in fact, I would say it's absolutely necessary when the context calls for it. However, I also think that when all you have is a hammer, suddenly everything starts to look like a nail. And why this is important, we'll see in the next clip.
Now, importantly, some warfare is something that actually happened. And based on the little bit that we do know, it was brutal and it was exhaustive. And what I mean by that was the intention of HEREM warfare was always the total annihilation of whoever it was that was devoted to destruction. We're coming back to this very important text, the Mesha Stele, because this is an example of this.
Now, I'm cutting him off here because he's made a claim that we need to talk about. First of all, warfare in the ancient world was brutal because it was infinitely more personal, simply due to how combat occurred. Swords and spears tend to make it really brutal. I mean, if you've seen Braveheart, while it's a different time, you get an idea of just how brutal and bloody it could be. That being said, just because of how it acquires a specific term, in this case, harem, doesn't change the fact that war is war, combat is combat. Second, where's the evidence that it was exhaustive and the intention of harem warfare was always the total annihilation of whoever it was that was devoted? I mean, really, where's the evidence? I mean, if you're going to argue that it's from the text, then you've got a problem because that's what's in question. Because that's where you're getting your evidence from. And I've already just demonstrated that just because people are haremed, Rahab, again, the prime example, they're not annihilated. That means that an object being declared as harem, what happens to it depends on what God decides to do with it. But let's continue listening to the last clip of this episode. That's fairly long, and we need to listen carefully because of what is said.
Of whoever it was that was devoted to destruction, whatever it was that was the Cherem offering. We're coming back to this very important text, the Mesha Stele, because this is an example of this practice being carried out by not just an Israelite, but a Canaanite king, the king of Moab, Mesha. And this took place in and around 835 BCE. And the Mesha Stele says, Chemosh said to me, go take Nebo from Israel. So I went by night and fought against it from the break of dawn until noon, taking it and slaying all 7,000 men, boys, women, girls, and pregnant women, for I had devoted them to destruction. That is the verb, charam, for Ashtar Kamosh, who was the divine consort that King Mesha the Moabite worshipped. And then he says, I took from there and it's broken off, unfortunately, of Yahweh, begging them before Chemosh. I think this is probably the priesthood of Yahweh in Nebo. It's interesting that there is a priesthood of Yahweh, and there would have to be a temple there then of Yahweh in Nebo in the 9th century. I'm going to come back to that in a little bit. I want to spend just a minute though dwelling on what's going on here. Mesha says that he annihilated, he slaughtered everyone as a devotion to his god at Nebo, except for the priests. I'm going to say this is probably the priests. Okay, priests of Yahweh. He seems to have kept them back and taken with him to his place of worship, the temple of Chemosh, which is probably in Kadesh, the capital of Moab. Now, this is Gavin when he talked about the Moabite stele, said that we know, or scholars say that the slaughter at Nebo wasn't total. It wasn't a complete annihilation, because of the way that Misha also exaggerates his descriptions of his victories in elsewhere on the stele. Now, I don't know how good of an argument I think that is. I would say that we don't really know the extent to which Misha was successful in obliterating everyone at Nebo. What we do have are some 8th to 7th century BCE mentions of Nebo in Isaiah 15 verse 2, Jeremiah 48 verse 1 and verse 22, where the site is ascribed to Moab. So whether or not this meant Mesha eliminated the entire populace and everyone that lived there, we can't say, but we do know that it's a city that Israel never managed to recover. This is from a book by Tracy Lemos, and she makes a really good point here about. Sorry, this isn't the book. This is an article that she wrote recently about genocide in the biblical text, and she says this. This text, the Misha inscription, is useful for various reasons. One is that it provides a 9th century terminus antiquem for the development of a genocidal practice referred to as HEREM, and for the development of extreme, even genocidal violence of a more general variety between Israelites and other groups. It might even strengthen the monarchic era dating of the biblical text that attests to the same usage of the term HEREM. Another important facet of this is that it demonstrates that genocidal violence occurred in the context of land dispute. Although more than one biblicist has attempted to minimize the severity of the genocidal passages of the Bible by stating that such violence did not really occur, the Misha inscription instead points one toward the conclusion that such violence did in fact sometimes happen. And the point she's making in her article is that these sorts of descriptions of total annihilation and violence using the term HEREM are most often attached to land disputes, to the acquisition and the taking of massive tracts of territory and property from other people groups. So
now I let Kipp go here for a rather long time, but there's some problems here with Kipp's language. And first is that herem is never used in regard to offerings or to sacrifice. In fact, Old Testament authors go out of their way to avoid using the language of offering or sacrifice or any associated words with it. Now, that's not to deny that the word doesn't have some pietistic element to it. However, the association is specifically avoided. Now, where do we find examples of this? Exodus 22:20, an Israelite idolater is heremed. The Hafel form of the verb is used in Leviticus 21:18 to describe someone who's been heremed. How they're not permitted to participate in the worship of Yahweh. Leviticus 27:28 and 29 provide some of the most interesting because they employ both the verb and the noun. Verse 28 saying that which is kedem, which has been heremed, cannot be redeemed or made useful because the kedem is Kadesh. It is holy. That seems to imply that there is a certain amount of pietism involved in setting it apart. Hareming takes place first. It's in leaving it alone. Verse 29 gives us this weird prohibition that states that the one who is kedem, because it has been haremed, is excluded from the possibility of redemption for the previously stated fact. So, what does the phrase translated, he shall be put to death, mean here? Is it referring to the one who has been haremed, that they are killed, or is it referring to the one who is attempting to redeem that which has been haremed? The language simply isn't altogether clear in that regard as to who is to be put to death, the one devoted or the one attempting to make the redemption. But given the fact that the Decalogue forbids murder, and human sacrifice is condemned elsewhere in the biblical text, reading through this, trying to figure out, come to the conclusion there's three potential ways to understand what's going on here. First, the person who's been permanently devoted should be considered as dead to the one who has devoted them, thereby removing them from the potential of being redeemed. The second way that this could be understood is if someone attempts to redeem that which has been permanently devoted, they are subject to death. Thus, it becomes a life for life exchange. And lastly, if a person who has been permanently devoted, haremed, attempts to reject that dedication, they are subject to death because their rejection is perceived as treason, which is a death penalty offense. Now, J. Sklar, his Leviticus commentary in the Tyndall Old Testament series, makes a distinction between that which is devoted and that which is dedicated. That which is devoted, haremed, is unredeemable. And that which is dedicated, nadard, is redeemable, but with exceptions. Now, this is because hareming assumes that the exchange has already taken place and has occurred, while the nadaring appears to assume the exchange hasn't taken place, or that the exchange isn't in some way permanent. Let's think of it this way. You've got a messenger app that allows you to stop a message from being sent to the recipient once you hit send. But once that message is gone, you can't take it back. But we can imagine if you could pay a fee and the message is deleted in transit before it's received or before it's read, or perhaps, and that's roughly how the distinction is made. But not all things that are nadard, dedicated, can be redeemed. There are certain exceptions, such as firstborn of livestock, or if you bring one animal in exchange for another, the second animal cannot be redeemed. However, once something has been haremed, it cannot be redeemed at all because it is permanently God's property. Now, let's talk about the Misha Stele for a moment, which is a memorial stone, and it dates roughly 9th century BC. And it appears what scholars of the stone have noted is that it seems to evidence multiple literary types in one example. Of course, what's interesting about the stela is that it appears to interact with the biblical narrative that's found in 2 Kings 3. Now, Kipp evidences that a lot has been made about the invocation of Harem against Israel. But what doesn't get mentioned, though, is that Israel never returns the favor. Israel never invokes Harem against Moab. However, and this is just kind of an aside, you can tuck this back in your hat. What's interesting is that we have another instance of Moab hareming something. That's found in 2 Chronicles 20:22, when they, along with the Ammonites, attack and destroy the inhabitants of Mount Seir. Here again, the verb is used as a stative, where it makes reference to a distinction between groups of people before an act of destruction is carried out. Now, it seems like that may be something important to mention, but why is that? Because it helps us to contextualize the word when we encounter it, which brings us to the source, namely Tracy Lemos's article, which Kipp refers to. Now, her article is interesting. I've read it. It's actually a chapter in a book, but it has a number of issues, and three of them that I found reading through it. First, it's an apple and orange comparison. She does this because she ignores important historical context. She mentions it, but she never interacts with it. And number three, she imputes motives unnecessarily. Now, she does this by um, comparing the 1994 Rwandan genocide to the Israelite conquest. And why is this a matter of apples and oranges? Because it's very difficult to qualify what exactly happened in Rwanda as genocide. Why is that? Well, it's because of the historical context, which now you more than likely learned this was about Hutus in Rwanda attacking Tutsis. And while that was part of it, Hutus also attacked Tutsi aligned Hutus as well as other minority populations after the nation's president, who was a Hutu, by the way, was allegedly assassinated by Tutsi militants, although that was never proven. And this did indeed appear to fuel a lingering spark of ethnic violence that had been smoldering since the nation had gained its independence in 1962. Lemos makes very little, if any, mention of these political realities leading up to the event, namely that the Hutus had been in control of the nation both politically and economically for over 2 decades at the time. Ironically, as a result of the Hutu reaction to the president's assassination, this actually allowed the Tutsi militants that had been exiled from the country to come back in and retake control of the country.
Ironic.
Now, allegedly, these were presented as boogeymen by the Hutus, but interesting to hear, though, when the Tutsis take control of the nation, they restore peace, and they do it without any accompanying bloodshed. Now, there is instances where it does spill over into other countries, but she seems to focus only on matters of population and geography, which may have been a contributing factor, but they don't adequately explain why the Tutsis haven't responded in kind to the Hutus who've remained in Rwanda and who are still the majority of the population. Now, why is this another problem? Why people do what they do is a matter of complex motivations. So when you try to limit motivations to one aspect as an exclusive causal element, then you could run into any number of problems with the reasoning, especially when historical realities are brought into play. This misattribution of motive really gets worked out by Lemos when she invokes the prophet Amos, describing actions which are vicious and horrific, no doubt, and terrible as being genocidal, when these are likely the farthest thought from the mind of the author. Now, another problem is she's already decided that whenever HEREM appears, it necessarily implies violence. But we've already established from its use in Leviticus this is not the case, evidenced by the fact there were members of groups that are haremed that continue to appear in the biblical text, sometimes even as key players, and they're often portrayed positively compared to Israelite heroes. But it also ignores instances where the term is turned inward on Israelites. In other words, Lemos has determined what she wants her conclusion to be, and she argues for it. And she reinforces this by the fact she regularly equates any violence done against those who have been haremed or that any who are classified as karim have automatically been killed. However, in spite of Lemos's faults, she does make a valid observation the invocation of HEREM does appear to be tied to land. She does this on page 39 and 40 of her chapter, but she continues her fallacious assumption that it involves killing a native population. Now, there's another option that I think we need to seriously consider. I believe that Leviticus 21:18, in terms of the cultic understanding that Kipp seeks to give us, it does give us incredible insight into HEREM as a state of action should be understood. And it's interesting and valuable because it provides us with a list of some obvious physical features that define certain people who are prohibited from participating as priests in the tabernacle or in worship. No man who has any defect is to come near, no man who is blind, lame, has been haremed or deformed, no man who has a broken foot or hand, who is hunchbacked or a dwarf, who has an eye defect, a festering rash, scabs, or a crushed testicle. Now, notice that this list contains a number of physical features and sometimes medical conditions that a person may possess, most of which are beyond their control, such as blindness or lameness or dwarfism, which seems strange to us. There's a whole reason for this we can go into later. I'm not going to right now. Verse 18 is curious though because it uses the verb harem to describe someone who cannot participate. Now, if you remember back in Joshua 6:17, when Jericho is haremed, keremed specifically, the noun form is used, but it is haremed to Yahweh as spoil. I noted that the classification included Rahab and everyone in her household, yet they were spared. They were still kerem, but they were shown mercy. Most modern translations will render the verb here as facially disfigured. This could give us some insight into what this could mean when harem is brought into the context of war. Verse 18 uses it uses the hafel form because it's the passive form. This is something that's been done to something because the hifel is the active causal form. This person has something imposed upon them. Something's been done to him. This means it could involve some type of standardized, readily recognized disfigurement. It was obvious, possibly for as punishment or some other offense. Leviticus 27 seems to assume this is a status sign. Now, we've got to deal with some of our assumptions because we simply don't have enough evidence to corroborate this. But as we close this part of the discussion, there are a few points we need to remember as we go forward. As a verb, herem is often used as a verb of state. It's used to signify that an object has been classified as disallowed for human use or marked off. Now, as a noun, an object that is kerem is considered off limits. Now, when an object has received or is identified by a status, it says nothing about how that object is to be treated. Now, while I noted that there appears to be some semantic overlap with other verbs that are related to destruction, that doesn't necessarily mean that that's what the verb harem means. Rather, it means that in incidental terms, it can be associated with them, and so it would need other verbs to kind of flesh that out. Other verbs or other descriptions that would need to clarify an end result or effect. This means we simply cannot make assumptions about the verb outside of a particular context it's being used in. So, with that being said, we come to the end of part 2. Now, in part 3, we're going to be continuing on this track, looking at the use of language and specifically with the causes of conflict. So, until then, I'm Sugarman 1976. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please be sure and hit that like button. If you don't mind, subscribe. All of the links are in the description below. Thanks for watching. God bless. Have a good day.